latest stories.
Make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel.
Right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hi there, really good afternoon to you. Coming up in the next hour, return of the Cold War. Does the Russian invasion of Ukraine mean it's time to pare back foreign aid and reverse the cuts to Britain's armed forces? I'll ask a former Defence Secretary. Also, the boss of the Reform Party will tell me why it's time to stop fighting with Russia over gas with one arm tied behind our backs. He says it's time to get fracking again in Britain. And why schools shouldn't be allowed to ban meat from the lunch menu without the say-so of parents. Alongside me throughout the next hour, our economics guru and former resident of Moscow, Liam Halligan. But first, the headlines with Miranda.
Good afternoon, it's 4:01. I'm Miranda Shunker in the GB newsroom. Well, in breaking news, Russia's Deputy Defence Minister has asked Moscow's upper parliament to approve the deployment of troops to Donbass. It comes after the UK imposed sanctions against 5 Russian banks and 3 very high net wealth individuals. The Prime Minister announced the first barrage of measures against the Kremlin, warning Vladimir Putin appears set on overrunning Ukraine. Well, Boris Johnson told MPs that Russia's deployment of troops into parts of eastern Ukraine, which Moscow now recognises as independent states, amounts to a renewed invasion of the country.
If the worst happens, then a European nation of 44 million men, women and children would become the target of a full-scale war of aggression, waged without a shred of justification for the absurd and even mystical reasons that Putin described last night. Unless the situation changes, the best efforts of the United States, of this country, France, Germany and other allies to avoid conflict through patient diplomacy may be in vain.
Well, meanwhile, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky says the country may now break ties with Russia.
I would like to tell you that I've received a request from the Foreign Ministry. I will consider the issue of severing diplomatic relations between Ukraine and the Russian Federation. Immediately after our press conference, I will consider this issue as well as other issues like our steps regarding escalation by the Russian Federation.
Well, in other news, Scotland's First Minister has announced the legal requirement to wear face coverings in shops and on public transport will end on March the 21st. Nicola Sturgeon says that using restrictions to suppress infection is no longer as necessary as it once was. Coronavirus passports are also being scrapped for nightclubs and large events. However, in contrast to England, the Scottish Government will continue its free testing programme and will advise people who test positive to keep isolating.
This change is possible because widespread vaccination coverage and better treatments have reduced the direct harms of the virus. As a result, using restrictions to suppress infection is no longer as necessary as it once was, and given the wider harms caused by protective measures, it is no longer as justifiable either.
The requirement for fully vaccinated UK tourists to take a coronavirus test before visiting the European Union is set to be removed before the Easter holidays. Travellers will then be allowed to enter the EU without any restrictions or conditions. However, the EU Council noted that its recommendation to end the rule is not a legally binding instrument and that the member states remain responsible for implementing it. The Queen has cancelled some virtual engagements scheduled for today. Buckingham Palace says Her Majesty is still experiencing mild cold-like symptoms after contracting COVID and will continue with light duties. It's understood her plans over the week will be decided nearer the time. The case against 4 men charged over the shooting of a black equal rights campaigner, Sasha Johnson, has collapsed after the prosecutor said they would not be pursuing it. The mother of 2 was shot in the head during a birthday party at a house in South London in May last year. Police say they do not believe she was the intended victim. The suspects denied conspiracy to murder and were due to stand trial in March. They've now been handed formal not guilty verdicts after no evidence was offered. Miss Johnson remains in hospital in a serious but stable condition. Flood-hit communities are urging the government to fund permanent defences as dozens of homes along the River Severn have been evacuated. Major incidents have been declared in Worcestershire and Shropshire as water levels along the river continue to rise. The Environment Agency is warning families and businesses in the West Midlands and the north of England to be prepared for significant flooding until tomorrow. Telford and Wrekin councillor Sean Davis told GB News a solution is urgently needed.
Whole swathes of this area aren't protected by any flood defences at all. Those properties and businesses that have got the temporary flood defences, which are deployed when the time is right, that's a huge amount of disruption. And I do think we do need to see a significant investment from the government around this. This is no longer a once in a 100-year event. This is something that's going to be with us time and time again, and we need permanent solutions.
Well, this is GB News. You're up to date. We'll bring you more news as it happens. Now let's get back to Brazier.
Well, a sort of history lesson to start with, but recent history. Last week, Russia scoffed at the very idea that it was planning to invade. Now its tanks are on the streets of Ukraine. According to one astonishing estimate, within 12 hours, the Russian army has already sent in 10,000 troops. By now, there will almost certainly be more. It's a blitzkrieg. Britain has imposed sanctions. Germany has canned its Nord Stream 2 pipeline. America is about to react publicly. We'll share that with you as and when we hear anything. The stock market, it's fallen sharply. There are more questions than answers right now. Putin says his troops are there to support separatists in 2 breakaway regions. But will his soldiers go beyond areas currently controlled by pro-Russian forces and start fighting and killing Ukrainian soldiers? How will the Ukrainians, some of them armed with anti-tank weapons supplied by us, by Britain, respond? It is a crisis, but one correctly predicted by Western spies who warned that Putin would use the excuse of helping Russian speakers to send in the heavy armour. A former British military head of NATO said today that this was the most dangerous moment in Europe since the end of World War II. Well, the head of NATO is speaking right now, Jens Stoltenberg. Let's just show you briefly what's happening at NATO. We'll keep across what Jens Stoltenberg has to say, and there in the centre of your frame you can see our economics editor Liam Halligan, who's going to reflect on not just what he's had to say, but a number of other features of this story. I'll also mark your card from 5. We'll be joined by the former Defence Secretary Michael Portillo for his take on events. Liam Halligan, as I say, alongside me to reflect on different aspects of this, Liam, not least the economic impact. Where are we?
Well, Russia's obviously one of the world's biggest energy exporters. It supplies Europe with 40% of its natural gas. The world's biggest wheat exporter as well. So as Western leaders have moved to put sanctions on Russia, they will have kept in mind our own cost of living crisis, the fact that a lot of families here in the UK are trying to beat the squeeze as petrol and diesel prices go up. And I must say, Colin, my overwhelming response to these sanctions is that they're pretty tepid. Financial markets seemed a lot more scared of what was going to happen this morning than what actually happened in terms of sanctions this afternoon. Yes, wholesale gas prices are elevated. You're going to see petrol and diesel go up even more on the forecourts over the next couple of days because those oil majors, they're never slow to ramp their prices up, are they? Especially on motorways, as GBNews viewers often tell me. But actually, the sanctions so far, they're pretty limp. And so financial markets haven't responded with as much turbulence as you might have thought.
I'm going to see if I can wave a magic wand and try and do something about this white line that's separating us. We've seen Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary-General of Nato.
Oh, Colin!
He can go, so we can actually have a proper conversation. There we go. Thank goodness. The technology sometimes gets in the way, as hinders as well as helps. I was really keen that you come in today, not least because, actually, you lived in Moscow. You've got a perspective on the Russian mindset that very few of us have. I was going to say happier times then, more relaxed times in a sense. But as you look at what's happening, and there was that extraordinary speech from the Prime Minister, our Prime Minister today, talking about the absurd mysticism that Putin's been using recently, talking about Ukraine being part of the greater Russia and all that stuff. That sense of Mother Russia and this mystical idea, what on earth does he mean by that?
It reminded me of Churchill. I'm sure that was no coincidence coming from the lips of Boris Johnson, of course, our great wartime leader, talking about Russia being a riddle inside an enigma wrapped in a mystery. Yeah, I lived in Moscow in the 90s. It's where I cut my journalistic teeth as a foreign correspondent. I lived there again in the noughties, as we must learn to call them. And so I've kind of steeped in the Russia story, spent a lot of my adult life covering and writing and reading about Russia and talking to lots of Russian and Ukrainian people. And I think it is true to say that there is a real closeness, a real affinity between the Russians and particularly East Ukraine. East Ukraine, east of the Dnieper, basically Ukraine's a country divided by a river. Kiev is right in the middle. The Dnieper goes through the middle of Ukraine. To the east of that, broadly speaking, it's Russian speaking. And to the west of that, it's Ukrainian speaking, a part of the world that over the years has been part of Poland. It's part of a Slavic sphere of influence, but a different sphere of influence. And I think for a lot of Russian people, East Ukraine does feel like at least somewhere that has affinity with Russia. The great irony here is, Colin, that Khrushchev, the Soviet Cold War leader, the guy who banged the shoe on the desk and said, "We will bury you," who faced up against John F. Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis, probably the only post-war moment that can be comparable to what we're currently living through. This is a serious situation, though. There's no nuclear weapons being wielded at this point. But Khrushchev was a Ukrainian. There was a real closeness between Russia and Ukraine during the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s, the late 80s, the early 90s, Ukraine became independent. And since then, those two halves of Ukraine, the Polish facing, EU facing, if you like, though the EU will never let them in. They're a bit too good at agriculture. Those Ukrainians would wind up the French and others. And the eastern part of Ukraine, the Russian-speaking part, I wouldn't say they felt like two countries, because there is a very strong Ukrainian national identity. And in better times, there is a feeling of national unity. I've been in Ukraine on National Unity Day, and it's quite a thing. But they do have different perspectives about Russia's intentions. And now we're seeing those two perspectives being blown apart.
And there's even, I suppose, there's a religious divide as well. More
the Catholic
side
and
on
then
the
Russian,
West and the Orthodox,
the Russian Orthodox Church
on the right.
too.
I'm just here. We are watching what Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, is saying. He's talked about sanctions. That's to be expected. He said, I think the exact quote is something along the lines of, "It's never too late to stop your attack." An invitation for the Russians to wind things back, wind their neck in, reverse the tanks, reverse the direction of travel today that we've seen. I'm also reading that the Russian president has asked the country's parliament for permission to use military force outside the country. Liam Halligan, he's pretending to be a full-throated Democrat. We all buy that, don't we?
I mean, the Russian parliament has some power, but not a lot of power when it comes to what the president wants. It is very much a presidential system, unlike ours. What I've been trying to focus on today and during my On the Money show, and we'll do more tomorrow at 1 p.m. lunchtime, is the implications. If you're sitting at home in the UK, this seems like two blokes in a TV studio wanging on about Khrushchev and history. Actually, this does have a really big implication for this cost of living crisis in terms of fuel prices, in terms of food prices, Colin. Russia's the world's biggest wheat exporter. Russia has put a ban on exports from Russia of something called potassium nitrate. What's that?
Fertiliser.
Fertiliser, exactly. And so lots of farmers I know are texting me, I live out in the country, what's happening in Russia, Ukraine? Because I need to know what fertiliser prices are going to be in 3 or 6 months' time, because I need to make an order. This is a big part of my cost base, as it is for many farmers here in the West. So, yes, there's lots of reasons why our Western leaders will want to impose sanctions on Ukraine, on Russia at the moment, because of this escalation in tensions with Ukraine. But they will have in the back of their mind, or even in the front of the mind, the implications on the cost of living crisis here in the West, on the implications for their voters.
Liam, want to talk some more about the cost of living crisis, but we'll save that for after our next item. But for now, thanks very much indeed. This time yesterday, the Prime Minister was telling us how to live with COVID, the end of self-isolation, at least for England. We wondered how long it would take, perhaps, for others to fall into line. Earlier today, the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, announced he would be imminently dropping the legal requirement to wear masks on the underground and on the buses. But in Edinburgh, the SNP leader, Nicola Sturgeon, has been, so far at least, reluctant to follow London's lead. Those masks, they'll be needed for another month, and self-isolation will stay as well. Well, joining me now, the leader of the Reform Party, that is Richard Tice. Lot to discuss with Richard Tice today, not least the necessity, Richard, as you would say, and I'm going to start with this actually rather than COVID, of the UK securing its energy supply. And to that end, you told me last week, we need to start fracking again.
We'll be very clear, Colin. Good afternoon. What I said is we need to start extracting the treasure from under our feet, Colin. It's called shale gas. We've got about £1 trillion worth. That's half the national debt. It equates to about 50 years of supply. And guess what it would do, Colin? You've just been talking about the impact of what's going on in Russia and Ukraine on energy prices. We could be self-reliant on energy and therefore, like the States, have dramatically lower fuel prices, dramatically lower gas and heating and electricity prices if we use our own energy resource, shale gas, North Sea gas. And there are new technologies, Colin, so it's really important. And I'll keep saying this and I'll say it until I'm blue in the face. There are other technologies. For those who are worried about the impact of fracking, put that to one side. There are other technologies to essentially access this shale gas, to get this shale gas out of the ground. That's great news. We should be at the forefront of using these new technologies. Imagine if we could reduce all our prices by 50% and be self-reliant and not be exposed to what's going on in Ukraine and Russia. That is smart politics. That's what our leaders should be doing.
Well, you say it's smart politics. I suppose there'll be plenty of people, the detractors, who will say there's a reason the moratorium on fracking was declared, because it wasn't safe. It may be safe in isolated parts of the Midwest, but here on this crowded island, it doesn't work. That said, I'll invite you to comment on this letter from the boss of Quadrilla that was published in recent days, and he's talking about some of the risks of earthquakes. He writes, Francis Egan, the limited number of fractures that his company Quadrilla was able to do was due to the regulatory requirement to halt operations any time microseismicity, a word I'm not used to using, as that probably seemed fairly obvious, induced by fracturing exceeded just 0.5 on the Richter scale. He goes on to say, a study by Liverpool University was equated the impact of a 0.5 microseismic event, and I can demonstrate this in a moment, to sitting down on an office chair. Thus,
correct.
Extraordinary.
Yeah, and that's how essentially the eco-zealots, well-funded by overseas money, I wonder where that came from, they essentially hijacked the debate, and the so-called earthquakes that were happening was no different to a large van or a lorry going past your door. That's not an earthquake. That is normal living. But look, in a sense, I'm going to come back to the point, whether you frack or don't frack, the asset is there. There are other ways of extracting it. We should be using that. We should be using the Quadrilla wells to use these new technologies rather than filling them up with cement, which of course is utterly ridiculous. And the key point is here, Colin, that we don't need to be dependent on other nations, rogue actors, for 50% of our energy. We used to be an energy exporter until the Conservatives took power in 2010. We're now a massive importer, we're vulnerable, we're exposed, and we need to turn around. That's why I say it's smart politics. And this, we could have this shale gas up and running and making a dramatic difference within 3 or 4 years. And I tell you that that's what I believe, that's what the people of this country want. They want cheaper energy, and they're patriotic, Colin. Yeah. We want to use our own natural resources. We don't want to increase CO2 emissions by millions of tons importing gas from elsewhere.
Yeah. It's more existential than that even, isn't it? I mean, it's not just about the prices. It's about reliability of supply. Not quite keeping the lights turned on, but making sure the heating's still working, that's for sure. Richard, we're going to leave it there. We've got a lot to get through today, but really appreciate your time, as ever. Thanks very much indeed, Richard Tice there. Liam Halligan alongside me. Just for a thought on fracking, which is a deeply unfashionable concept. But when you look at the numbers, the Forest of Bowland, underneath the Forest of Bowland there in Lancashire, vast quantities of shale gas available if we have the political will to get to it.
You mentioned Francis Egan there, the CEO of Quadrilla, of course, a company that's spent millions of pounds exploring the case for fracking in the UK, employed hundreds of people, particularly up in the northeast. I interviewed him on my show a few weeks ago when we were indeed GB News Northwest Week up in Blackpool, and he made this point. Of course, he made arguments that fracking's safe and there's been alarmism, and the US LNG lobby doesn't want us fracking because it wants to sell us gas in ships and so on. But he also made the point that where these shale reserves are, they're often in parts of the country where the Tories need to win, the red wall. So these are seats where there isn't a lot of high-level industrial work. There aren't well-paid blue-collar jobs. Guess what? Fracking, shale gas industry provides a lot of highly skilled, highly paid blue-collar jobs for a lot of workers. So that animus will be gnawing away at the Prime Minister as well. Does he continue to bang the drum for net zero and rah, 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 and the UK is at the forefront of net zero? Or does he think, actually, I need to win in those red wall seats, I need to bring down wholesale gas prices, I need to show increasing numbers, not just of my own backbenchers, but some Labour backbenchers as well in the North and the Midlands where this fracking would take place, that I mean business, as the cost of living squeeze comes in, some of that kind of green maximalism may fall by the wayside.
You'd have to say, Liam, there's never a better chance for the Prime. I don't want to sound cynical, but he will never have a better chance to reverse something seemingly as politically beyond the pale as fracking has been able to point to a diplomatic crisis.
That's the point of this crisis. It brings everything centre stage. Nerdy subjects, UK gas storage, fracking. Suddenly, they're Major League politics.
Liam, for now, thanks very much indeed. We're going to bring you the weather right now.
Hello again. The winds are easing through the rest of today, but guess what? The winds will be picking up once more tomorrow, and the weather continues to keep us on our toes with more rain for Scotland and Northern Ireland. This weather front's been sinking south today. It's going to be followed by this one coming in tomorrow. In between, well, I say the winds are at least easing a little bit, and that will allow it to turn quite cold through this evening and overnight, particularly across England and Wales, where the skies will mostly be clear. A few scattered showers over northern England. Certainly we'll keep showers going in western Scotland with a bit of snow over the hills. The winds will start to pick up once more in the northwest, but elsewhere the winds are at least a little bit lighter, certainly a lot lighter than yesterday. And temperatures as a result, with the clear skies, getting down to 2 or 3 degrees. Pockets of frost likely in rural areas. During Wednesday, though, the winds will increase once more. We do have a Met Office yellow warning for northeast England, southeast Scotland. Gusts of wind could suddenly pick it up here through the day. At the same time, rain will push southwards through Scotland and Northern Ireland. Quite a wet afternoon through the Central Belt and Northern Ireland, with some snow on the hills. Bar the odd shower, though. Most of England and Wales will have a dry day on a Wednesday with some sunny spells. Temperatures double figures again here, so pretty mild. However, colder weather is on the way. As this rain band pushes south, colder air follows, with increasing chance of seeing some problems with snow across Northern Ireland, western Scotland, and again, those gusty winds. So we have a Met Office yellow warning here through Wednesday night and into Thursday. It'll be rain across England and Wales. That rain band will continue to slip southwards, eventually clearing from East Anglia in the southeast at some time on Thursday morning. Brighter skies follow, but more of these wintry showers. So the snow could really build up over western Scotland, Northern Ireland during Thursday, and the winds continuing to gust at times. So again, that could also cause some further disruption. A cold day everywhere on Thursday.
I'm Liam Halligan. Join me every weekday at 1 p.m. for On the Money, your daily dose of economics, business and consumer news. I got 25 years experience covering economics and finance. We hold grown-up discussions with a host of experts who really know their stuff. We can't buy gas and store it. That was a mistake, wasn't it?
I think it was a mistake.
Even you, Liam, don't have a crystal ball.
Inflation's a real threat.
Every weekday at 1, you're On the Money.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back. Here with Colin Brazier on GB News, on TV, online and on radio. Now, the Met Office has issued 2 severe flood warnings for Shropshire and Worcestershire, where water levels pose a, quote, significant risk to life. This is following in the steps of Storm Franklin. Over the past week, 3 storms, as you know, have hit the UK, killing 4 people at least and leaving some 1.4 million homes without power. Well, we're joined by our East Midlands reporter, Will Hollis, and our Yorkshire and Humberside reporter, Anna Riley. Welcome to you both, and thanks for patiently telling this story in difficult conditions today. Will, let's start with you.
Yes, good afternoon. The rain has stopped here in Shropshire. You could easily be fooled in thinking it's a nice day here, but it's certainly not a nice day for the people who live along the banks of the River Severn. Where I am right now, this is just a car park with a whole load of groundwater just along the banks of the River Severn, but just right next to me here at Iron Bridge is what is usually the relatively calm River Severn. It's currently at around 6 metres and 50 centimetres. The highest it's ever gotten to is around 7 metres. That was in the year 2000. The Environment Agency is looking very closely at how this situation is going to play out. Already around 60 properties and people living there have been evacuated or certainly approached for evacuation. We've been told by the council that some people are choosing to stay home, even with this mass of the river just on their doorstep. We are expecting from the Environment Agency that this particular severe flood warning on this part of the River Severn here at Iron Bridge is going to start to subside tonight. The peak of it should be tonight, but just down the road from Shropshire in Worcestershire, we are expecting the Bewdley severe flood warning to continue on throughout the night and probably on to tomorrow. So that's just the 2 severe flood warnings, but elsewhere in the UK there's around 100 flood warnings, and we've seen the effects of this storm set of 3 different storms that's really caused havoc for people up and down the country and has left car parks like this, homes and pubs underwater. One of the homes and pubs down a little bit further along in a place called Jackfield, a pub that's been flooded so many times that we've been told from local people that it seems that the landlords are deciding to give up on that trade, and it's been such a problem over the years that it's time for them to pack up the pub trade. But here, this does seem to be a situation that is going to continue right into the night, but hopefully from the Environment Agency, they reckon that it will start to subside over the evening.
Fingers crossed. Will, thanks very much indeed. Well, let's turn to our Yorkshire and Humber reporter, Anna Riley. Anna, welcome to you. I think you're in York. If you are, I can guess where you are, having worked there myself in an office close by the River Ouse and occasionally having drunk in a pub, which was used to flood on a perennial basis. Are you by the banks of the Ouse?
Good afternoon, Colin. Yes, I am. Like you say, York is a place that always gets hit hard by flooding, and this heavy rain that we've had over the last few days has certainly contributed to the floodwaters rising at the River Ouse. You might be able to see behind me, I'm at a car park as well near the city centre, St George's Field car park, and you can see that car there is just submerged in the water, and there's at least 4 others in there just consumed by the water, and obviously having to wait for this water to subside before people can come and rescue their cars. The level of the River Ouse is at around 4.58 metres at the moment, and the normal level is around 2 metres, and the floods were the worst in 2015. It's not hit those peak levels, but it's around the levels of the February 2020 flooding. And like Will was saying here as well, homes have had to be evacuated. The council offered emergency accommodation to 140 residents. Not everybody luckily had to take up that accommodation, and businesses as well also shut. So here we're looking at a wind warning. The Met Office have said there's strong winds tomorrow, but luckily and hopefully this rain has subsided and the floodwaters will ease for people living here.
Anna, thanks very much indeed. Anna Riley joining us from York. Our thanks to all our reporters today. Been putting it up with some difficult conditions out there. Liam Halligan's alongside me to reflect on the fact that there we are telling, offering our viewers pictures, and apologies to anybody listening on radio. They get a sense of how bad things have been. There's always a price tag to these floods, isn't there, for the insurers, not least of all.
Indeed. I mean, over many years, I remember as a cub reporter reporting on floods in Shrewsbury. Obviously, down at Iron Bridge, close to Shrewsbury, we've seen flooding today. The government set up a scheme in the early 2000s that the insurers would have like a central fund to try and compensate flood victims. The scheme has never really got off the ground. Premiums have generally been higher, and the government hasn't really spent all that much money on flood defences. They're relying generally on so-called temporary flood barriers. They're called pallet barriers, rather than building permanent flood defences. And a really big issue, Colin, and I scratch my head, it's a real bugbear of mine. We still get lots and lots of developers being given planning permission to build on floodplains because it's cheaper land for them, but the houses aren't cheaper, and the householders desperate for new homes. We've got such a shortage of new homes in this country, as I've often said. It's just storing up problems for ordinary, often young families in their first home.
Well, like you, plenty of floods down the years. Somerset levels, remember the Somerset
Indeed.
levels really bad, but it's one thing to be a farmer and say, OK, it's inundated, we'll wait for the flood waters to subside and we'll get planting crops again. Homes are a different story, aren't they? Liam, much more from you, I'm sure, coming up in the course of the next hour. But we're going to bring you the news bulletin now with Miranda.
Thank you, Colin. It's 4:33. The top stories from the GB newsroom. In breaking news, the Russian parliament has given President Vladimir Putin the green light to deploy armed forces abroad. Despite the upper house saying the troops should be deployed for peacekeeping tasks, there are fears the vote could open the door for a broader attack on Ukraine. The UK has now imposed sanctions against 5 Russian banks, along with 3 very high net wealth individuals. And the US is also expected to announce new sanctions and export controls. The NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg says it's not too late for Moscow to step back.
We have over 100 jets at high alert, and there are more than 120 Allied ships at the sea from the high north to the Mediterranean. This is the most dangerous moment in European security for a generation. But Europe and North America continue to stand strong together in NATO, united and committed to defend and protect each other.
Well, in other news, a legal requirement to wear face coverings in shops and on public transport in Scotland will end on March the 21st. First Minister Nicola Sturgeon says that using restrictions to suppress infection is no longer necessary as it once was. Coronavirus passports are also being scrapped for nightclubs and large events. The Queen has cancelled some virtual engagements scheduled for today. Buckingham Palace says Her Majesty is still experiencing mild cold-like symptoms after contracting COVID and will continue with light duties. And flood-hit communities are urging the government to fund permanent defences after dozens of homes along the River Severn were evacuated. Major incidents have been declared in Worcestershire and Shropshire as water levels along the river continue to rise. The Environment Agency is warning families and businesses in the West Midlands and the north of England to be prepared for significant flooding until tomorrow. Well, on TV, online and DAB Plus radio, this is GB News. Now let's get straight back to Brazier.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back. You're with Colin Brazier on GB News on TV, online and on radio. We're going to whisk you back to our top story, and not least because Vladimir Putin is addressing an audience in Moscow. Can we show you those pictures? Because that's all we're going to do. We don't have a translation. So just to show you that this is hotly pursued, this game right now. He's managed to secure a democratic legitimacy so far as it exists by getting his legislators to approve military action in Ukraine. I mean, that's sort of, I think that's probably fair to say it's paying lip service to democracy. He gets to pretty much do what he likes. Nonetheless, it's given it, I suppose, his actions in Ukraine a kind of a cloak of respectability. As you look at him, focus on these words. Russian tanks and troops, they've entered Ukraine in what the government is calling, he's just stepped off the stage there, is calling the beginning of an invasion. More than 10,000 soldiers, Russian soldiers, entered separatist-occupied areas overnight. We understand that 6,000 were sent to Donetsk, almost that number to Luhansk, and 1,500 to the city of Hovlika. What does it mean then for the British Army? Estonia called for more NATO troops to act as a deterrent against Russia. Are we looking then at a return to the days when thousands of our soldiers were permanently garrisoned in Germany, there to ward off aggression from Moscow? Well, let's turn to the former Secretary of State for Defence, Sir Michael Fallon. Michael Fallon, thanks so much for your time. Do appreciate it. How much of a turning point do you think this is, events of the last 24 hours?
This is a turning point, no question about it. We're not just on the slide to war, but we're seeing a sea change in the arrangements, the security arrangements of Europe. That we've lived through a long period of peace in Europe where borders were relatively stable, until just recently, when Russia invaded Georgia 12 years ago and then invaded the Crimea 8 years ago. And that is going to have long-term repercussions. As you've just said, Colin, we're going to see more troop deployments, probably on both sides. We're going to see quite significant trade disruption between Russia and the West. And we're probably going to see higher energy prices as well as a result. So, this... What has happened in the last 2 or 3 days is going to mean, sadly, lots of lives lost in eastern Ukraine, but is going to undermine the security of all of us in Europe.
On those troop deployments, I mean, we assume at this stage that they're temporary deployments for our troops to be moved to those eastern NATO member states. My introduction there touched on this idea that there may be more permanent garrisoning of some of those bases close by the border. I know, people read last week, we are now the third biggest spender on defence in the world. So there'll be some people who will say, we're spending quite enough, thank you very much, on defence right now. What do you say?
Well, we're not third. I don't think we are. I think we're fifth or sixth in terms of spending. But the country that's dramatically increased its defence expenditure is Russia. So clearly the previous sanctions that were applied haven't really deterred Putin from invading other countries. So far as the deployments are concerned, when you say they're recent, Colin, I sent troops to Estonia back in 2015. That's 7 years ago. We've had deployments in Estonia. I sent RAF Typhoons down to Romania. We've had Royal Navy ships in the Black Sea. So this isn't, new or sudden. We've been building up, actually, deployments on the eastern edge of NATO, because that's what those members have been asking for. They feel very vulnerable now when they've seen what Russia has done in Georgia and the Ukraine, and they are members of NATO. We are obliged to help them where we can, and that is why you've now seen British troops in Estonia and more recently in Poland as well.
And yet we are ploughing ahead with reductions in cap badges and regiments, and there are those generals, I imagine you will have worked with some of them, who say there comes a point below which you cannot go, and they use this word mass, that you have to have a degree of mass, sheer numbers, if you are to be a serious player in conflicts like this.
Well, I agree with that. And NATO said that as a very minimum, countries that belong to NATO should be spending at least 2% of their GDP, of their national wealth on defence. And we meet that target, we're exceeding it. And our defence expenditure, as you yourself have just said, is going up again. But we need to spend, across the board, not just on numbers of soldiers. We need to spend to be able to resist cyber attacks. We need to spend on new aircraft. We've spent on 2 very large aircraft carriers, and we need to be able to deploy in all parts of Europe and all parts of the world. So, there's always an argument for more defence expenditure. But I think what's happened in the last few days shows that as well as fighting terrorism in the Middle East and sending an aircraft carrier to the Pacific, you've got to look after your own backyard as well. And what happens on the continent of Europe, in the end, affects us, as we know to our cost twice in the last century.
I suppose what was scratching away at the back of my head, and what I was trying to weave into that introduction, was: are we set to return potentially to those days of the 70s and 80s when you had the British Army on the Rhine? It was tens of thousands strong. There were people whose childhoods were spent growing up in Germany, Brits abroad, in substantial numbers. Whether we are beginning to see perhaps a shift in direction back to something more like that, as opposed to that fairly limited deployment, as you say, which you signed off back in 2015.
Yes, and NATO had been deployed much further afield. NATO had a mission out in Afghanistan and so on. Clearly now, members of NATO feel they need to protect, particularly their eastern, northeastern and southeastern borders. And that's why you've seen several thousand American troops going to reinforce Poland. And that's why we're making a commitment, as I understand it, to send more troops to Estonia and some more troops to Poland. And we need to do that. That is the point of NATO. It is a defensive organisation, and members who feel threatened are entitled under NATO to ask us to come to their help.
Defence, as we know, is an incredibly expensive insurance policy. It's a mischievous question, this, but it is a question that's prompted by a lot of the emails we see here. People saying, spend more on defence. Keeping the country safe, the defence of the realm is any government's top priority. Where's the money going to come from? Stop spending so much money on foreign aid to kleptocratic countries where the spending can't be controlled. Often it's good money after bad. Cut the foreign aid budget, spend it on our own defence. What do you say to people who argue that?
Well, government has cut foreign aid in the last couple of years and has gone away from the target of spending whatever it is, 0.7%. So there have been some cuts. And I think ministers are also trying to spend the aid better rather than hand it over to large world organisations to spend it on programmes that are, specifically dedicated to relieving poverty on the ground. But the two things in the end, Colin, are linked. If you don't deal with the breakdown of security in some African countries, you get mass migration to Europe, and there's a cost to that. If you don't deal with international terrorism in the Middle East, then that terrorism comes back and smacks you here in Europe. So there is a link between the amount you can spend overseas and the need to protect yourself at home.
So, Michael Fallon, really good to talk to you. Thanks ever so much for your time.
Thank you, Colin.
Liam Halligan alongside me to reflect on this point, Liam. I mean, and some people will say, don't be getting into that right now. It's an off-colour remark. But that if you are making tanks in Britain, bullets in Nottingham, Challenger tanks in Newcastle, whatever it is you do, there's a sense in which conflict is good for business.
Well, let me approach this as a business and economics correspondent, right? British defence industry is big business. We're a major defence supplier. We have some world-class defence companies, some of them household names, some of them not. And this is clearly a moment when, while our soldiers are risking their lives, and obviously there are big issues of geopolitics at stake, this is obviously a time when orders in the defence industry are up, and that has implications for local jobs, particularly in constituencies outside of London. Is that the motivation for the British government's actions here? No, I don't believe that for 1 second, and I think both of us would agree on that, Colin. But on the other hand, it is the case that defence spending in Britain is likely to rise as a result of this, but it's matching, as Sir Michael Fallon rightly said, higher defence spending in Russia, much, much higher defence spending in China, with the US still the world's defence behemoth, if you like, in terms of the size of its army.
I'm going to check my figure, by the way.
And the amount of money.
Well, on that, I read, I'm pretty sure last week, that we are now the third biggest spender, which does seem very high, I grant you. He said, Sir Michael Fallon said, no, that's way too high. I'm going to check it for both our in the interest of both of us. And we're going to move on to another story now, and thanks to Liam. The Education Secretary, Nadeem Zahawi, has expressed concern about schools banning meat from their lunch menus. It comes after parents at Barrowford Primary School in Lancashire were told meat was banned from their children's canteen. Parental choice and the health of children, two concerns, but the school's head teacher said she had made the decision in order to, quote, stop climate change, and cited the carbon footprint caused by the livestock industry. It's a claim many farming and rural campaign groups dispute, including my next guest. The Chief Executive of the Countryside Alliance is Tim Bonner, who joins us now. Tim Bonner, thanks so much for your time. Appreciate it. What do you say to this head teacher who said no more meat on the school menu? In fact, don't even bring meat in your packed lunches and your lunch boxes because I want to help the environment?
Well, frankly, it's ridiculous, Colin, to suggest that you can fly an avocado from California or Mexico, which has been grown in fairly unsustainable circumstances anyway, and that's going to have a lower carbon footprint than a lamb that's grown across the road from your school, which is grass-fed, which is on a farm, which has got a huge range of biodiversity. I mean, it is complete nonsense. And our concern is that underlying this isn't just a discussion about carbon and global warming. It's actually an ideological attack on livestock farming, on farming as we know it, and on eating meat as a whole. So we don't think that schools should be involved in this sort of campaigning, and we think the Education Secretary was absolutely right to say that they should allow children choice.
How much of a worry is it that farmers? I interview farmers fairly regularly on this on my programme. It feels to a lot of people are losing the argument that this head teacher speaks to a growing mindset, which is not only is global warming settled science, the role of agriculture within climate change is settled science. Now, you and I both know that's rubbish, that actually there's lots of data there, whether it's the amount of methane that's produced that disappears within a decade, not so much of a problem, whether it's the fixing of carbon in pasture, in grassland, and oh boy, isn't this country brilliant at producing grass, and sometimes rather than growing crops, that's what we do best, and when you've got grass, you grow animals on it that then fertilise the soil, on and on and on. Lots of arguments, very positive for meat, but not being made.
Well, I think the one thing that is being made is that people love it. And demand for meat isn't dropping. In fact, the opposite. And then during lockdown, we saw a huge demand for meat across the board. But it's about quality, and it's about how that meat's produced. And it's perfectly possible to produce meat in a sustainable way. We see it all over Britain. We see great systems based on grass. But it's also, we need to be honest about this, it's also perfectly possible to have livestock systems which aren't particularly sustainable, which are questionable. But exactly the same can be said of growing all sorts of crops as well, which it may be vegan, but if you fly over the south of Spain and see the acres of glass houses and the use of pesticides and fertilisers which are used to produce those products, it's just as unsustainable. So we should be looking at quality, we should be thinking about what we eat, and we should be sourcing stuff sustainably, not suggesting, which is entirely wrong, that the whole The whole livestock farming industry is somehow unsustainable, and somehow that eating meat isn't compatible with having an ethical approach to food and to the way we treat the planet.
And just one final brief point, Tim Bonner. When you've got a school like this, I mean, there's a democratic principle at stake, it seems to me, here. I mean, this is a head teacher almost treating her school like a personal fiefdom for her political pet projects. But I shouldn't think she's alone in that. And to some degree, that's, they answer to a local authority or to parent governors. There are some democratic checks and balances in place. What do you think went wrong at this particular institution?
Well, I think there is, and we must be honest about it. There is, as you mentioned earlier, there is a perception among some people, and promoted by a lot of people, that meat is bad. And I'm not to judge, because I don't know whether the head teacher in this situation honestly believes that this is a way of tackling global warming, or whether she has an ideological approach which means that she's quite keen to see pupils not eating meat anyway. But in either case, there is a fundamental issue about choice and about freedom and about the ability to do that. And I found it quite extraordinary. I'm sure the parents at the school found it quite extraordinary as well. It's not only was she saying that we're not going to serve this stuff on our menu, but you cannot bring it in. You cannot bring meat into this school and eat it in your packed lunch, which is it's something that I think politicians should be addressing. And we've suggested to the Education Secretary that there's actually proper guidance, rather than just agreeing with us, that he might be able to put that in writing, in guidance for the future.
Tim Bonner, got to leave it there. Really appreciate your time. Thanks very much indeed. Let's bring you a look at the weather now.
Hello again. The winds are easing through the rest of today, but guess what? The winds will be picking up once more tomorrow, and the weather continues to keep us on our toes with more rain for Scotland and Northern Ireland. This weather front's been sinking south today. It's going to be followed by this one coming in tomorrow. In between, well, I say the winds are at least easing a little bit, and that will allow it to turn quite cold through this evening and overnight, particularly across England and Wales, where the skies will mostly be clear. A few scattered showers over northern England. Certainly will keep showers going in western Scotland, with a bit of snow over the hills. The winds will start to pick up once more in the northwest, but elsewhere the winds are at least a little bit lighter, certainly a lot lighter than yesterday. And temperatures as a result, with the clear skies, getting down to 2 or 3 degrees, pockets of frost likely in rural areas. During Wednesday, though, the winds will increase once more. We do have a Met Office yellow warning for northeast England, southeast Scotland. Gusts of wind could suddenly pick up here through the day. At the same time, rain will push southwards through Scotland and Northern Ireland. Quite a wet afternoon through the Central Belt and Northern Ireland, with some snow on the hills. Bar the odd shower, though. Most of England and Wales will have a dry day on a Wednesday with some sunny spells. Temperatures double figures again here, so pretty mild. However, colder weather is on the way. As this rain band pushes south, colder air follows, with increasing chance of seeing some problems with snow across Northern Ireland, western Scotland, and again, those gusty winds. So we have a Met Office yellow warning here through Wednesday night and into Thursday. It'll be rain across England and Wales. That rain band will continue to slip southwards, eventually clearing from East Anglia in the southeast sometime on Thursday morning. Brighter skies follow, but more of these wintry showers. So the snow could really build up over western Scotland, Northern Ireland during Thursday, and the winds continuing to gust at times. So again, that could also cause some further disruption. A cold day everywhere on Thursday.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Just a couple of minutes before the top of the hour. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Lots of talk around Ukraine. Obviously, today you've been sharing your opinions. Neil says shades of 1939 in terms of preparation. Russia and China have been building their military over the past 2 decades. The West, with the exception of the United States, have not. Time for a rethink. Jack says we should immediately end all foreign aid, as it's time we stop filling the world's begging bowls. British taxpayers' money should only be spent on British people. Liam Halligan, our economics editor, alongside me, and was listening to the disputes, too strong a word, between Michael Fallon, former Defence Secretary, who took issue with my recollection of a statistical data point from last week that the UK is now the 3rd biggest defence spender in the world. He said that can't be right, is it?
So typically for the economics guy, I was burrowing away looking at the numbers, and the US defence establishment spends in 2021 it spent about £780 billion dollars. Sorry, way more than anyone else. The next nearest is China, on around $250 billion. So the US spends 3 times more than China. So they're number 1, 2. Then 3, 4 and 5, you have 3 countries that are very close. India on about $70 billion, Russia on about $60 billion, and the UK on about $60 billion. So on those dollar numbers, we're 5th. But if you convert those dollars into rupees in the case of India and rubles in the case of Russia, those dollar-ruble, dollar-rupee exchange rates move around a lot, particularly at a moment like now where the ruble's tanking because the world's going, oh my God, there's a Russian invasion of Ukraine. So in that sense, we may be 3rd at the moment. It's a bit like what's the world's 5th biggest economy? Is it Britain or France? And newspaper headline writers go nuts when it changes, but it often changes because there's a movement in the exchange rate, which means mathematically there's a change of place. So elegantly, both you, Colin, and Sir Michael Fallon, you're both right.
Thanks for clearing that up, Liam. Thanks very much indeed. It's 5 o'clock. Coming up, live at 5, is the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the most dangerous moment in world history since the Cuban Missile Crisis. I'll talk to one of America's most respected columnists. The former leader of the opposition, Sir Ian Duncan-Smith, joins me to weigh in on how he believes the West should react to Russia's advancements. And as Nicola Sturgeon says, COVID tests in Scotland will remain free. We'll ask how she plans to pay for them. If you are confused, you'll be watching TV and seeing the wrong pictures go with my words. Apologies there about a previous story. Oh, look, there's Nicola Sturgeon. That all makes sense. And if you're listening on radio, some of it makes sense. Alongside me this hour, we hope to have the former Defence Secretary, Michael Portillo, with me. In the meantime, Liam Halligan will be sticking around. But first, let's clear things up with the headlines and Miranda.
Good afternoon. It's 1 minute past 5. The top stories from the GB newsroom. The Russian parliament has given President Vladimir Putin the green light to deploy armed forces abroad. Despite the upper house saying troops should be deployed for peacekeeping tasks, there are fears the vote could open the door for a broader attack on Ukraine. President Putin says the situation on the ground in Donbass will dictate the actions of the military. He's called for Crimea to be recognised as part of Russia, a halt to weapons shipments to the country, and an end to Kiev's NATO bid. Well, the NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg says Europe is on heightened alert.
We have over 100 jets at high alert, and there are more than 120 Allied ships at the sea from the high north to the Mediterranean. This is the most dangerous moment in European security for a generation. But Europe and North America continue to stand strong together in NATO, united and committed to defend and protect each other.
Well, meanwhile, US President Joe Biden is expected to announce severe sanctions during a news conference at 6 o'clock this evening. It comes after the UK imposed its own sanctions against 5 Russian banks and 3 very high net wealth individuals. Boris Johnson told MPs that Russia's troop deployment amounts to a renewed invasion of the country.
We will not allow Putin to drag our continent back into a Hobbesian state of nature where aggression pays and might is right. And it is precisely because the stakes are so high that Putin's venture in Ukraine must fail.
Well, earlier, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky warned his country may now break ties with Russia.
I would like to tell you that I've received a request from the Foreign Ministry. I will consider the issue of severing diplomatic relations between Ukraine and the Russian Federation. Immediately after our press conference, I will consider this issue as well as other issues like our steps regarding escalation by the Russian Federation.
Well, to other news now. An illegal requirement to wear face coverings in shops and on public transport will end on March the 21st in Scotland. First Minister Nicola Sturgeon says that using restrictions to suppress infection is no longer needed. Coronavirus passports are also being scrapped for nightclubs and large events. However, in contrast to England, the Scottish Government will continue its free testing programme and will advise people who test positive to keep isolating.
This change is possible because widespread vaccination coverage and better treatments have reduced the direct harms of the virus. As a result, using restrictions to suppress infection is no longer as necessary as it once was, and given the wider harms caused by protective measures, it is no longer as justifiable either.
And the requirement for fully vaccinated UK tourists to take a coronavirus test before visiting the European Union is set to be removed before the Easter holidays. Travellers will then be allowed to enter the EU without any restrictions or conditions. However, the EU Council has said the member states remain responsible for implementing it. The Queen has cancelled some virtual engagements scheduled for today. Buckingham Palace says Her Majesty is still experiencing mild cold-like symptoms after contracting COVID and will continue with light duties. It's understood her plans over the coming week will be decided nearer the time. Flood-hit communities are urging the government to fund permanent defences as dozens of homes along the River Severn have been evacuated. Major incidents have been declared in Worcestershire and Shropshire as water levels along the river continue to rise. The Environment Agency is warning families and businesses in the West Midlands and the north of England to be prepared for significant flooding until tomorrow. Telford and Wrekin councillor Sean Davis told GB News a solution is urgently needed.
Whole swathes of this area aren't protected by any flood defences at all. Those properties and businesses that have got the temporary flood defences, which are deployed when the time is right, that's a huge amount of disruption. And I do think we do need to see a significant investment from the government around this. This is no longer a once in a 100-year event. This is something that's going to be with us time and time again, and we need permanent solutions.
Well, this is GB News. We'll bring you more news as it happens. Now it's back to Brazier.
Vladimir Putin has just been speaking. We'll take you through some of what he's had to say. But last week, Russia was scoffing at the idea that it was planning to invade. Now its tanks are on the streets of Ukraine. According to one estimate, within 12 hours, the Russian army had already sent in 10,000 troops. By now, there'll almost certainly be more. Britain has imposed sanctions. Germany's canned its Nord Stream 2 pipeline. America, we imagine, is about to react, at least publicly. At the stock market, it's fallen in certain parts of the world pretty sharply. And there are more questions, really, than answers right now. It's that stage of events. Putin says his troops are there to support separatists in 2 breakaway regions. But there's a few questions. Will his soldiers go beyond areas currently controlled by those pro-Russian forces and start actually fighting and killing Ukrainian soldiers? How will Ukrainians, some of them armed with anti-tank weapons supplied by Britain, respond? It's a crisis, but one correctly predicted by Western spies who warned that Putin would use the excuse of helping Russian speakers to send in the heavy armour. A former British military head of Nato said today that this was the most dangerous moment in Europe since the end of World War II. Who better to talk about this than the former Defence Secretary here in the UK, Michael Portillo, who's alongside me, will be for the next hour, for which thanks very much indeed. Your thoughts today, Michael?
Well, I'm here with a very heavy heart. I had hoped we would not arrive at this moment, but things became gloomier last week. You say that the Russians were scoffing at the idea of invasion, but they had a proviso at the end of every sentence, which was unless they were provoked. And of course, they were organising the so-called provocation. Even more chillingly, last night, Putin, in this very long address, doubted the independent existence of Ukraine. He was doubting whether this was a legitimate country, that it had ever really had a legitimate independent existence. Now, that is a very serious position, because it means then that his ambitions would not be limited to these 2 regions where he's entered, which arguably were pretty much already under Russian control. That would suggest that he has a much bigger ambition. And I think it is true that he, and probably many other Russians, really do assert that Ukraine has always been part of Russia, and that what's happened in the last 30 or 40 years is entirely anomalous. And there is an enormous amount of emotion and cultural tie involved in this. Kiev was a city when Moscow was a village. Kiev is full of the most important religious buildings in the Russian Orthodox religion. The origins of Russia are probably a tribe called the Kiev Rus, who originated in Kiev. Therefore, it's hard to describe how to many Russians how central Kiev and Ukraine are to all of Russia. And I think this has always put the West in a difficult position, because we need to understand this culturally in order to understand the Russian mentality. When I was a defense minister, the Soviet Union had quite recently collapsed. There were democracies now in Eastern Europe, and these democracies wanted to join NATO of their own free will. They wanted to join NATO urgently because they had been under the heel of the Russians. They were horribly repressed. Whenever they showed signs of resistance, they were crushed again by invasions. They were held in by walls and by barbed wire, and when they tried to escape to freedom, they were shot dead. It's worth remembering all of this. You know, when Putin says NATO is a threat, no, all these countries joined voluntarily, and the reason they joined is that Russia is a threat. But when I was the defence minister, whilst we were very happy to extend the NATO Article 5 guarantee to these new countries entering NATO, we were never willing to do that with Ukraine. And here has been a difficult point for the West, because if you're not willing to extend the Article 5 guarantee to Ukraine, in a way, tacitly, you're saying Ukraine is different.
And Michael, the reason for that was what? Because of this mystical stuff? Because it was too far east? Because it, what?
I think in a way, because the possibility that Russia would assert its claim on Ukraine again was too probable. You didn't want to create a circumstance in which you were going to commit yourself to a war with Russia. Guarantee. Were we in a way saying that of influence? In diplomatic terms, I think this has been very awkward, but it has been a hiatus. And it's one in a way that obviously Putin has spotted. He knows that we're not going to go to war over Ukraine. And I fear from what he was saying last night that entering these peripheral regions is not the end of it, that the annexation of Ukraine may be the objective. And that is horrible because we will see a free people taken over by the Russians again. We will see a terrible repression. We will not respond with warfare. There will be bloodshed. There will be a collapse in the relations between the Russians and the West. There will be cyber warfare. There will be economic warfare. There'll be enormous damage to them and enormous damage to us.
I want to go to a guest who's patiently waiting, and we'll have time to talk in the future. But just as you describe it, and I think this is dawning on a lot of people now, and in a word, if that's possible, is this the beginning of a new Cold War?
If he goes further than he is at the moment, yes.
OK. Back to Michael Portillo very soon. Let's speak now to Valerie Akimenko from the Conflict Studies Research Centre, who can offer us a fresh perspective on this. Valerie, welcome to you. We know, don't we, from what Vladimir Putin said last night, that Ukraine means something not just in terms of a place on a map or in terms of industrial production or exports and imports or even gas. It speaks to the Russian soul, and that makes the calculations that we have to arrive at in the West a bit more difficult.
Hello, Colin. Yes, I would agree with you. I would also wholeheartedly agree with Michael Portillo's overall assessment of the state of affairs, as it were. However, to assert that Ukraine and Russia, as Mr. Putin is fond of saying, are one people, as it were, is probably not entirely correct. And by that, what I mean is that even if we accept that there are significant ethnic commonalities between the people of Russia and the people of Ukraine, I think as a result of the divorce of the 1990s, when at the turn of the 1990s the Soviet Union fell apart and Ukraine gained or voted to become independent, irrevocable changes have taken place in the psyche of the people of Ukraine. The differences have become not so much ethnic, but if you wish, socio-political. I can't imagine many in Ukraine would like to find themselves now, despite all the commonalities between Russia and Ukraine, in the grasp of Mr. Putin once again.
Yeah, they've grown probably quite fond of the idea of being the authors of their own destiny and deciding where they point their ship of state, I imagine, Valerie. Do you think he'll go the whole hog, Vladimir Putin, or just settle on occupying these two territories?
The way I see the situation is, if I may use a kind of military doctrinal technical term, a very tall escalation ladder where Putin, or the Russian Federation or the Kremlin, call it what you will, has very capably engineered a very long route, if you wish, along which it can take one escalatory step after another. So, for example, the latest developments, such as his recognition of Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics as independent, followed by the largely technical moves, such as his expressed readiness to send in peacekeepers, quote unquote, and most recently the vote in the Russian upper house of parliament to authorize the use of Russian troops abroad, are all steps along this escalation ladder. And as he sees it, that is a very long route indeed. For example, today, just now, he said that Russian troops not yet have been sent into East Ukraine, into the People's Republics in question, but if need be, there will be. That is one possible step on this escalation ladder. Another, undeniably, would be for these peacekeepers, as he keeps calling them, to fan out of the regions in question and, for example, reach the administrative borders of the full regions in question, Donetsk and Luhansk. At the moment, they're just a portion of those.
Yeah.
Yet another step, of course, would be an even further escalation, such as, for example, the occupation of the whole of the southern swathe of Ukraine, all the way to Odessa, along the Black Sea coast, all the way to Moldova. Finally, there is such a possibility, of course, as outright invasion. By that, it need not
Valerie
be
Yakovenko, it's interesting that the White House are calling it an invasion today. Not everybody is, but the White House have changed their tune a little bit, and they are using that word now. Valerie Yakovenko, we appreciate your time. Thanks very much indeed for joining us today. Well, I mentioned the Americans. Let's say in North America, Canada's parliament has backed the government's decision there to impose emergency powers to deal with weeks-long protest blockades against COVID restrictions. The motion, it was passed with 185 votes to 151 on Monday, with the support of the Liberals and a left-leaning party. Well, my next guest is a Canadian journalist who was tear-gassed while covering the trucker protests. Andrew Lawton joins me now. Andrew, welcome to you. We've talked to you several times in recent weeks. You've now suffered for your pains, it seems.
Yes, I should issue a slight correction. I don't know if it's much of an improvement. I was pepper sprayed, not tear gas, but either way, it was quite bananas at what was a very peaceful protest until the enforcement measures started.
Those enforcement measures have captured a lot of headline space around the world, Andrew. Sometimes it's difficult to get a perspective from a distance. I read, actually, I mean, we've had this conversation to and fro, as I say, in recent weeks, but you will read stuff here in London suggesting that actually there are lots of people in Ottawa who just wanted those freedom protests out of the way.
Yeah, that's certainly true. I mean, at the very beginning, the honking was particularly incessant, and there was a court challenge about that. The judge granted an injunction, and by and large, the honking stopped. And one of the other points that had developed in the last couple of weeks is the trucks that had been in residential areas, all in an agreement with the government, had moved downtown. Now, it was still disruptive. I'm not saying that at all, but the question is, did that disruption rise to the level of a national emergency, triggering what are ultimately wartime measures, and which, as you mentioned in your introduction there, the government is still insisting need to be in place for a blockade and a protest that at this point no longer exists.
Yeah, we were talking, I think, Andrew, last week, making the point that if you look, for instance, at some of the protests that have really irritated people in the UK recently, the Insulate Britain protests, you may have heard of them, people with an environmental agenda, blocking major arterial roads, busiest motorway in the country, the M25, police looking at times quite impotent to do anything about it. If the British government had invoked emergency powers reserved for terrorists, I think even people, like me, who were critical of the protesters' objectives, aims and tactics, would have thrown our hands up in the air and said, too far.
Yeah, I think you're right there. I mean, one of the leaders of this protest is in jail right now. She was denied bail by a judge this morning and is in jail indefinitely on a charge of mischief. You have a government that's still going after freezing bank accounts without a warrant, without even the accusation of a crime, of people that it says were connected to the protest in some way, with very broad latitude as far as how they apply that definition, and no legal recourse. So it is quite significant, and the implications of this for other protests are as well. But interestingly enough, even some of those who have supported the indefinite extension of this emergency have said, yeah, but it's different from when environmentalists are protesting. It's different when unions are protesting. Well, really? Just because you don't like this particular protest doesn't mean that you're not giving future governments that aren't on side with what you believe license to take the same approach to protests that are inconvenient to them.
The principle is the key thing, isn't it, in this as in all things. Andrew Lawton, so good to talk to you. Whatever the effects of the pepper spray were, they seem to have been more than adequately dealt with. Thanks very much indeed, Andrew. Nice to talk to you again.
Thank you.
Michael Portillo alongside me to reflect on Canada, if you can.
Yes.
And Justin Trudeau, poster boy for Liberals the world over, but making a bit of a hash of this, I think.
Well, absolutely. And what an irony that he has the epithet liberal. It really does alarm me. We've had 2 years of COVID and we've had 2 years of authoritarianism within democracies. And even when I was in Parliament, we were very wary of giving government powers, emergency powers, because, of course, any minister will say at the dispatch box in Parliament, these powers will only be used in these circumstances. And he'll be referring, no doubt, to terror or to war or something like that. But then, of course, governments, and even local governments in this country, have found it convenient to use powers that are there basically to counter terrorism, to counter things that they have found inconvenient. And that is what has happened in Canada, I'm very much in agreement with you. I was driven mad by the Extinction Rebellion people. Yeah, driven mad by them, and I wanted them off the streets. But if someone had said, oh, well, let's freeze their bank accounts, I would certainly have protested against that, because that just is not the right application of the right sort of measure.
Events in Canada have read like a parable. You know, it wasn't just the apparent hypocrisy of Trudeau invoking some of these powers. When GoFundMe said, we will take the $9 million that have been donated to the truckers and we'll take it off them and we'll hand it to charities who we deem the appropriate recipients. They later revoked that idea. But you know, all that sort of stuff from the wilder shores from the internet you read about tech running the world and having an agenda that's only aligned with one political perspective suddenly rang true.
And Andrew made a very important point there, didn't he? Which is that the blockade is finished. So, I mean, even if these emergency powers have been justified, which in my view, and I think yours, they were not, they're still in place even though the blockade has come to an end. I do think in general, there's a big competition in the world now between the authoritarian regimes like China and Russia and the liberal regimes, the democracies. And some of this is played out over COVID. And I think, for example, that we have done quite well. I know we've had a lot of deaths over COVID, but I think we have maintained a lot of freedoms and we're now returning quickly to freedom. A country like China is locked down. I don't know how it's ever going to get out of lockdown because its vaccines have not been very effective. It has a zero COVID policy. Zero COVID policy, in my view, is doomed to failure. So in all of this, we're going to learn lessons about the success of authoritarian regimes versus democracy. It's all part of this very important competition between two ways of seeing the world, two systems of government, one of which is accountable and one of which is not. And it's quite disappointing to find Canada at the moment in the wrong category.
Well, hopefully we'll talk how that impacts on COVID and some of the problems that revolve around that with democracy as well. Michael, for now, thanks very much indeed. We're going to take a break right now.
Hello again. The winds are easing through the rest of today, but guess what? The winds will be picking up once more tomorrow, and the weather continues to keep us on our toes with more rain for Scotland and Northern Ireland. This weather front's been sinking south today. It's going to be followed by this one coming in tomorrow. In between, well, I say the winds are at least easing a little bit, and that will allow it to turn quite cold through this evening and overnight, particularly across England and Wales, where the skies will mostly be clear. A few scattered showers over northern England. Certainly we'll keep showers going in western Scotland with a bit of snow over the hills. The winds will start to pick up once more in the northwest, but elsewhere the winds are at least a little bit lighter, certainly a lot lighter than yesterday. And temperatures as a result, with the clear skies, getting down to 2 or 3 degrees. Pockets of frost likely in rural areas. During Wednesday, though, the winds will increase once more. We do have a Met Office yellow warning for northeast England, southeast Scotland. Gusts of wind could suddenly pick up here through the day. At the same time, rain will push southwards through Scotland and Northern Ireland. Quite a wet afternoon through the Central Belt and Northern Ireland, with some snow on the hills. Bar the odd shower, though. Most of England and Wales will have a dry day on a Wednesday with some sunny spells. Temperatures double figures again here, so pretty mild. However, colder weather is on the way. As this rain band pushes south, colder air follows, with increasing chance of seeing some problems with snow across Northern Ireland, western Scotland, and again, those gusty winds. So we have a Met Office yellow warning here through Wednesday night and into Thursday. It'll be rain across England and Wales. That rain band will continue to slip southwards, eventually clearing from East Anglia in the southeast at some time on Thursday morning. Brighter skies follow, but more of these wintry showers. So the snow could really build up over western Scotland, Northern Ireland during Thursday, and the winds continuing to gust at times. So again, that could also cause some further disruption. A cold day everywhere on Thursday.
My name's Tom Harwood, and every weekday we bring you The Briefing live from 9:30 a.m. The stories, analysis and live debate that you need to hear.
Quite right, Tom, of course.
Was this something that had been considered at all?
Difficult to answer.
Gas-guzzling helicopters circling. Noise is being made here.
Joe Biden walking out.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, Monday to Friday, 9:30 a.m. on GB News.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before. Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Well, it's all change in terms of COVID regulations, isn't it? Around about this time yesterday, the Prime Minister was making clear that we were going to have to learn to live with COVID. The Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, indicated today that some of the rules, the bylaws effectively that govern the use of masks on the London Underground and on the London Transport Network, that would go. Nicola Sturgeon in Holyrood made a statement saying that Scotland would be following along, but not for a while yet. And things like self-isolation would carry on for a while longer. Michael Portillo, former UK Defence Secretary, alongside me to reflect on where we are now with COVID and what it means for individuals, but what it means for our political philosophy as a country.
Well, where to begin? First of all, I celebrate the removal of the restrictions in England. It's what I've been looking forward to for a very long time. My analysis of what's been going on in England for a long time is that Boris really has been pushed by whoever has been the bigger bully in the room. And for a long time, that was the SAGE committee, it was the medics who always said, look, you've got to close things down, and if you don't, you'll be to blame, and the public inquiry one day will find that you rejected our advice.
That's kind of okay. I mean, I object to it, but it's kind of okay. But he as our elected politician, can turn around and say, he can say...
So I was going to say that now the biggest bully in the room, in a way, are the Conservative backbenchers. So before Christmas, there was this vital moment where 100 backbenchers voted against COVID passports. Suddenly the balance of power shifted. Boris began to respond to the backbenchers more than to the SAGE committee, and he got through that very well. I mean, you know, things did not turn out as badly as some of those, particularly Jenny Harris was telling us, that they didn't turn out as badly as that at all. So he's now going for removal of restrictions. There's a big political risk, which is the ending of the free tests. And why is that a political risk? Because it sounds like same old Tory, that is to say, poor people won't be able to afford the tests.
£2 billion a month.
Yes, poor people won't be able to afford the tests, and poor people will feel reluctant to take time off work because they need the money. There is a part solution to this, which ministers don't mention, which is that you buy the free tests, that you obtain the free tests now, because you're allowed to obtain a packet of free tests.
And people have been stockpiling.
Well, the first thing I did when I heard the restrictions were changing was I got myself a free packet. But you can get yourself a free packet every 72 hours. Now, ministers are not advertising this, but I believe this goes on until the end of March. So actually, families will be able to have, if they're worried about being able to afford the test, they will be able to have a large number. And I dare say that charities would be able to amass.
Is this former cabinet minister advocates panic buying headline?
This is a political analyst saying how, practically speaking, this problem will be dealt with. But notice it obviously is perceived to be a political issue because Nicola Sturgeon is doing something different.
With whose money?
Yes, a good question. I don't know
the answer to that.
I'm not entirely sure exactly where all the health money comes from. Let's hope it has some impact upon Scotland. No, of course I sympathise with the government wanting to end the $2 billion a month of the costs of the free tests. I just say that it does raise a political question. It's clear that it's a political question because Nicola Sturgeon's gone the other way, and that practically speaking, it will be slightly ameliorated and assuaged by people having amassed tests in the interval.
It's been pointed out to me, by the way, when I was indicating that Boris Johnson has the right to stick two fingers up at those scientists. I didn't actually say that. I just motioned with two fingers, which, if you are listening on DAB radio, is pretty meaningless.
But one lesson I hope will be learned. There's going to be a huge battle about what lessons should be learned. But one thing is, you never should have just a medical committee. You should have a medical committee, an economic committee, a mental health committee. So the Prime Minister says, I've heard this advice, but this advice is different, this advice is different. And he has a balance of advice. He has made himself a hostage to the medics, and the medics have always erred on the side of caution.
Yep, that feels absolutely true. I think a lot of our viewers will be nodding along vigorously at that point. Let's get the rest of the day's news now from Miranda.
Thank you, Colin. It's 5:33. The top stories from the GB newsroom this hour. The Russian parliament has given President Vladimir Putin the green light to deploy armed forces abroad. Despite the upper house saying the troops should be used for peacekeeping, there are fears the vote could open the door for a broader attack on Ukraine. President Putin says the situation on the ground in Donbass will dictate the actions of the military. Meanwhile, US President Joe Biden is widely expected to announce a raft of severe sanctions against Russia during a news conference at 6 o'clock this evening. It follows the UK government, who've imposed sanctions against 5 Russian banks and 3 very high net wealth individuals. The Prime Minister Boris Johnson told MPs that Russia's troop deployment amounts to a renewed invasion of the country. A legal requirement to wear face masks in shops and on public transport in Scotland will end on the 21st of March. First Minister Nicola Sturgeon says that restrictions are no longer needed to suppress infection. Coronavirus passports are also being scrapped for nightclubs and large events. And flood-hit communities are urging the government to fund permanent defences after dozens of homes along the River Severn were evacuated. Major incidents have been declared in Worcestershire and Shropshire as water levels along the river continue to rise. The Environment Agency is warning people in the West Midlands and the north of England to be prepared for significant flooding until tomorrow. Well, on TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. We'll have the latest headlines for you at the top of the next hour.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back. You're with Colin Brazier on GB News on TV, online and on radio. Let's return you to the lifting of lockdown restrictions, at least in England. The Prime Minister announced yesterday, around about this time, that COVID curbs are ending after 2 years of really unprecedented government interference in our lives and businesses. The nightlife sector has been amongst the worst hit by the pandemic, often forgotten. Let's return to Michael Kill, the CEO of the Nighttime Industries Association. Welcome to you. I'm guessing you'd have been pleased, from an English perspective at least, by what you heard yesterday.
Very much so. I think the industry welcomed the position. I don't think the industry at any point, even since the 19th of July, have lost sight of baseline mitigations and the fact that we, even with this lifting of the legislative position, we still must maintain and ensure that we continue with that sustained trading period. But without a doubt, it's been met with some level of celebration. And today, obviously, hearing Scotland's position, again, another positive step forward.
Michael, what did it do the last 2 years to that relationship between the authorities, whether that was a local authority or central government, and the people trying to scratch a living out of the nighttime sector? I mean, some of the loopholes that are being exploited. I'm thinking of Scotland, where, to get around the ban on dancing, people moved tables onto the dance floor and said it's actually a restaurant. How's that relationship changed? How's it been corroded over the last 2 years?
I think it's a mix. I mean, I think you have to understand that when these regulations came out from central government, there was as much confusion as there in local authorities and policing as there was with operators. So there was a little bit of sort of linked arms trying to understand or really interpret the requirement, particularly in the early stages of the pandemic. It's built a certain position. There have been some challenges, as you can appreciate, with all businesses. They're trying to get to a point where they can make their businesses work. We've seen tables go onto dance floors. We've seen lots of different variations falling outside of scope with COVID passports, just so that they can maintain their business and keep their staff employed. So I don't think the operators place so much focus on the local authority and police, more on the fact that central government have administered this and somewhat marginalised or placed many of the late nights economy into quite a precarious and difficult and fragile position over the last 2 years.
Michael, we're short for time today, so we're going to rattle on with the rest of the day's news, but we appreciate your time. Thanks very much indeed. Let's move back to Ukraine. Our next guest is opposed to external military intervention in the conflict. He questions whether a free world exists to stand up for the rights of democracies anymore. Quite a couple of claims there. We're joined then by Sohrab Ahmari, the author and contributing editor of the American conservative magazine. Sohrab Ahmari, it's good of you to join us today. Really appreciate it. What have you made of the events of the last 24 hours?
Well, it's still unclear what President Putin's intentions are, so I'm watching like everyone else. I'm just trying not to predict, as everyone else seems to be prognosticating and ending up with egg on everyone's faces, because how many times has this White House, how many times have others in power predicted that this Wednesday night, this Tuesday night, there's going to be an invasion, and then events haven't transpired that way. So I don't know. The situation seems tense. I try to just think about it from the point of view of U.S. interests and U.S. national security. and what ought we to do, rather than trying to predict what a Russian leader might do. And there, I do think that we have to be leaning toward de-escalation, that at the end of the day, the United States and Britain can't be more zealous for European continental security than the continent's core powers are. And the fact is that, as a Pew poll showed in 2020, only 53% of French people, 53% of French people oppose fulfilling NATO's Article 5 obligation if a fellow NATO member is attacked. That figure is 60% for Germans. Now, Ukraine isn't even a NATO member. And so that's the popular attitude in the two core powers of the continent. It's bizarre for Americans to be more zealous than people on the ground in the continent. And Nord Stream 2 is another sign that for a long time, Germany's leadership class is very comfortable with Russia.
Yeah.
In fact, the surest route out of the German government after you left government was to become a Russian energy lobbyist of some sort or another. So it just seems weird to me that Americans should be more concerned. And especially at a time when we're very broken internally. We've had 2 decades of failed interventions in the Middle East and North Africa. Domestically, addicts, social turmoil. We can't agree what a man or a woman is. We can't agree on our history. It seems bizarre for a power.
I'm going to stop you there. There's so much. There's so many topics you introduced there. I mean, I think you're probably right. I think a lot of Germans would rather have, cheap central heating than a right to self-determination in Kiev. I mean, there's so many. Gerhard Schroeder, remember him, former German chancellor who has become a sort of Putin stooge. Just on the point about, you're absolutely right. It's so refreshing to hear any analyst say, I'm not in the business of predicting. I was talking to Michael Portillo, a former British Defence Secretary, alongside me here in the studio, and May pitching with better questions than I can possibly produce. But we were talking during the commercial break about the fact that it's not always easy to look at someone like Putin, who you think is this sort of rational actor, and work entirely on the basis of the idea that he is this sort of calculator, rational calculator. Here is a man who in the early 1990s, when the Soviet Union was falling to pieces and Russia was going to the dogs, forced to drive a taxi, in that reduced state, having been a KGB colonel with all the status that went with that. So, predictions are for the birds.
Yeah, I mean, but I also want to be very clear that I think it's a mistake to paint Vladimir Putin as this sort of psychotic madman. If you view it from the point of view of a lot of powers elsewhere in the world, it's the United States that has acted quite erratically the past few decades. It's the United States that's launched, pointless wars, which, by the way, some of them I supported at the time in my youthful naivete, but have turned out to be pretty bad. So if you look at the United States record, why did we overthrow Gaddafi without any sense of what to do in Libya? Is that really what a rational leader would do? And if you look at Putin,
you know what? I'm going to stop you because you introduced too many interesting things. I mean, just on Gaddafi, I interviewed Colonel Gaddafi about a year before he was killed. I remember asking him about whether it was wise to have given up his nuclear program. If he was still alive, I think he'd probably say no. I think some Ukrainians, if you said to them, was it wise to give up your nuclear weapons now, scratching their heads, might say no, because the world's a tough place, isn't it? And weakness is often punished.
Absolutely. And look, the fact is that the Russian position has been for a long time, and I'm certain that it wouldn't, even under, let's say, a Navalny government. Navalny is as you know, the Russian dissident. Even under a Navalny government, the Russian Federation would not want NATO right at its doorstep. It would not want, U.S. strategic weapons potentially deployed in Ukraine. And look, the fact is that there is no right to join the Western alliance, and the easiest way to de-escalate this would have been a few weeks ago, a few months ago, a few years ago, for the Western powers to make it clear that there's no path to membership for Ukraine in NATO. And could that have de-escalated things? I believe so, because I think the Russian position has been very clear. And again, I don't think it's irrational. You don't have to love Vladimir Putin to say that, look, how would we feel if there were Russian bases in Mexico, we being the Americans, right? So I'm not suggesting there's a moral equivalence between the United States and Russia either, but nevertheless, that's how people think about their security. So it seems to me that we have to be a little bit more realistic, a little bit less sentimental in how we think about these things, and a kind of Finland-like solution for Ukraine is not crazy, and maybe it's still, one hopes, attainable.
Sarah, Michael Portillo's got a question, I think. Michael.
Well, maybe a comment. Sorry, I think you make a very good point about the conduct of the United States and its allies. It makes it morally complicated. But I suppose one of the great achievements that I've witnessed during my lifetime has been the freeing of Eastern Europe. I mean, these were people who were repressed by the Russians, and I never dreamt that the Soviet Union would come to an end and that I'd see Hungarians and Poles and Romanians and Bulgarians and Estonians set free. And what worries me, and where there is an interest for the United States and for Britain and so on, is that if Russia is allowed, without much price being paid, to take over Ukraine, then at the very least the security of those newly freed nations is put in doubt. And Russia may doubt whether we really would invoke Article 5. You've talked about the Poles in Germany and France. So, you know, what is Estonia, what is Lithuania to make of this situation if we don't respond pretty firmly to this aggression?
So to be very clear, I insist, and in all my writing have said that the United States, even as it moves, I think, toward a more restrained foreign policy. And if you think about successive administrations, the U.S. is trying, under the Trump administration, under Biden administration, in some ways, under Obama, has been trying to retrench away from the aggressive commitments of the George W. Bush administration. But even as we do that, we have to stand by treaty allies. Because as you said, if we don't stand up by treaty allies, then our word will come to mean even less than it does now. So I'm with you there. But Ukraine is not, we don't have the same kind of treaty commitments that we do. Yeah, I know there's a Budapest memorandum of guaranteeing their territorial security, but it's not quite the same as of an Article 5 guarantee. And so I think as the U.S. looks to a world in which we have to choose our battles, it seems to me rational to say, okay, we've made these Article 5 commitments to these countries, but no further, because especially not right near Russia's doorstep.
Sarah Bamari, before we let you go, can you just give us a sense of how big a story this is in the States right now? UK playing big, as you'd expect, but what about in the States?
Of course, in the sort of elite coastal media, it's a huge deal. On Twitter, among journalists, and I think of Twitter as video game for journalists like me, of course, it's catnip and everyone's obsessed about it. I think in the middle of the country, among broad masses, honestly, Ukraine seems so far away from our concerns. We have a huge illegal immigration problem. So when you talk about securing a border thousands of miles away to Americans, where we have tens of thousands crossing our border without controls, without our sense of sovereignty, it's enraging, frankly, in some instances. And you don't have to be a kind of mindless populist to feel some sympathy for the vast number of Americans who tell pollsters they don't really care about Ukraine, and their appetite for kind of confrontation with Russia over Ukraine is pretty low.
Sarah Bamari, really good to talk to you as ever, and appreciate your time. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank Michael Portillo for some thoughts on that and more. As Sarah makes clear, it's invidious to draw parallels with other events in history because there are different moral questions faced at that time. But I couldn't help thinking when he talked there about 1939 and how unpopular a conflict that would have been, advocated by the likes of Winston Churchill. I don't know if there weren't polling organisations then testing or gauging British public opinion. But I suspect if you asked 100 people on the streets of London in 1939, do you fancy another war because the Germans are getting uppity? Most people would have said no.
Well, everybody loves peace and everybody fears war, and those are two very, very important emotions. I was struck, as Sorab was speaking, that he and I were making the same points, but it's interesting that if you change the nuance of some of your points, if you change the emphasis of some of your points, it sounds very, very different. So I, earlier, talking to you, had conceded that, of course, we have not given an Article 5 guarantee to Ukraine. We never were going to. We never should. Putin knows that, and he knows that he can take Ukraine without having a war with the West. But is there a vital United States interest? Is there a vital interest for us? Yes, because the liberty of peoples does matter to us. We're a people who live with liberty. We should want other people to do so and to help to protect that status for them.
With the usual apologies to anybody listening on DAB radio, we're going to flash up live pictures of Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, who's speaking now. I think I've got a précis of some of her remarks. She's basically saying she supports the German decision to cancel Nord Stream 2. Interestingly, of course, she's a former German defence minister, did the same job that Michael Portillo did in Britain in Germany. Michael, reflect on a couple of things about the German position right now. They've been bullish about, perhaps surprised some people by cancelling Nord Stream 2, because hitherto they've not been particularly hawkish. They sent 5,000 helmets to Ukraine and insisted that our plane carrying anti-tank weapons didn't fly in their airspace. But obviously, for historical reasons, they're in a very difficult position.
Are we sure that the verb is to cancel? Are we sure that the verb is to cancel?
Or postpone?
I suspect, I suspect even to pause. So I suspect that this is an action without any great consequence. And I suppose that this is what they've been persuaded to say by the United States. But I would be very surprised if on the first day of this, let's face it, somewhat limited action, it hasn't gone up that ladder of escalation that we were talking about earlier. I'd be very surprised if they said they had cancelled Nord Stream 2. But I just want to put in a word of real annoyance that the Germans have put themselves in a position where they've cancelled nuclear power, which is a carbon-free energy source, and they have made themselves thoroughly dependent on Russian gas. They're reinforcing their dependence with a new pipeline. And people in Britain may wonder why it is that we're paying green levies and why it is that we're not allowed to frack our own gas and we're not allowed to develop the North Sea while the European Union is sucking in gas through a new pipeline and putting themselves in hock to Russia, which makes it impossible for us to have a united front against dictators.
It was one of the maddest decisions of recent years. I was in Japan for the tsunami, and whatever else you thought about what was happening in Japan with their Fukushima nuclear power station, cancelling German nuclear power as a consequence seemed very, very odd, but we are sort of reaping the whirlwind one way or another now. Chip Chapman, Major General Chip Chapman can join us now for a military perspective on this, former senior military figure, of course, and regular contributor here. Chip Chapman, welcome to you. Michael Portillo's alongside us, former Defence Secretary. Your boss, I imagine, at some point. Now you get to tell him what you really think. We were discussing earlier about whether we are in for Cold War II and whether the garrisoning of substantial numbers of British soldiers in Eastern Europe is something that's going to come back in.
Well, it will. So we've said before, Colin, in 2016, we went to a deterrence posture from a reassurance posture from the Warsaw Summit. And that's what led to the enhanced forward presence, the battle groups in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania and Poland. And of course, the reinforcement as we speak now of the Estonia battle group by one Royal Welsh going from Germany, where they've just finished their training across those countries. I have an equity in that because my son's just been in Germany and done the training with them. So that deterrence by denial will continue, and that becomes your containment line against any further aggression from Ukraine, from Russia across Ukraine and into the NATO countries, particularly important for those Baltic countries, as you said before, with Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. So that puts it in context. In terms of what I think is going to happen, rather than your last commentator, we've really had a bite and hold strategy at the moment. Forget all that nonsense about peacekeeping, because you shouldn't use those words, because both sides should agree to that. So this is an invasion of the Donbass. So we still have this nature of the Russians where they still have all those troops there, which could be used for coercive diplomacy, which means give in further, or we might go to the next option, which is seize and withhold. That is going onto the left bank of Ukraine, the Dnieper. And if that doesn't work, you then go to shock and awe, which is capture Ukraine, and then what follows after that.
Chip Chapman, we'll leave it there. We're out of time, but we thank you for yours. Joe Biden is expected to brief the press at the White House at the top of the next hour. We'll bring that to you live, of course. We'll say thank you to Michael Portillo, former British Defence Secretary, who, if he can spin it in 20 seconds, if you can just sum up why, if you can explain, Michael, to our viewers who do not follow foreign affairs, why they should be following this story. Should they?
There's a dictator and an imperialist on the loose in Europe. He wants to swallow up chunks of territory. We've seen this sort of thing before. We are concerned about liberty. We've had great success in the last few decades in freeing people in Europe. So we should be unhappy about what is happening, and we should make sure that Putin does not want to swallow more beyond Ukraine.
You're a master of brevity. You sum it up beautifully. Thank you, Michael Portillo. The weather is next. Stay with us.
Hello again. The winds are easing through the rest of today, but guess what? The winds will be picking up once more tomorrow, and the weather continues to keep us on our toes with more rain for Scotland and Northern Ireland. This weather front's been sinking south today. It's going to be followed by this one coming in tomorrow. In between, well, I say the winds are at least easing a little bit, and that will allow it to turn quite cold through this evening and overnight, particularly across England and Wales, where the skies will mostly be clear. A few scattered showers over northern England. Certainly we'll keep showers going in western Scotland with a bit of snow over the hills. The winds will start to pick up once more in the northwest, but elsewhere the winds are at least a little bit lighter, certainly a lot lighter than yesterday. And temperatures as a result, with the clear skies, getting down to 2 or 3 degrees. Pockets of frost likely in rural areas. During Wednesday, though, the winds will increase once more. We do have a Met Office yellow warning for northeast England, southeast Scotland. Gusts of wind could suddenly pick it up here through the day. At the same time, rain will push southwards through Scotland and Northern Ireland. Quite a wet afternoon through the Central Belt and Northern Ireland, with some snow on the hills. Bar the odd shower, though. Most of England and Wales will have a dry day on a Wednesday with some sunny spells. Temperatures double figures again here, so pretty mild. However, colder weather is on the way. As this rain band pushes south, colder air follows, with increasing chance of seeing some problems with snow across Northern Ireland, western Scotland, and again, those gusty winds. So we have a Met Office yellow warning here through Wednesday night and into Thursday. It'll be rain across England and Wales. That rain band will continue to slip southwards, eventually clearing from East Anglia in the southeast at some time on Thursday morning. Brighter skies follow, but more of these wintry showers. So the snow could really build up over western Scotland, Northern Ireland during Thursday, and the winds continuing to gust at times. So again, that could also cause some further disruption. A cold day everywhere on Thursday.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content